이제 다음은 차량의 속도 변수 추가. 한번 보자.
Our vehicle now can drive all the way down the road. We have all these obstacles that they can collide with. It has a whole bunch of physics applied to it, but our vehicle still moves a little bit fast, so we want to be able to change it, and we also want to be able to see it.
속도 변경
We're going to use something
확인.
called a variable. So in our player controller script, right underneath this first curly brace, underneath player controller, we're going to create a new line by pressing enter, and then on that new line, we're
잠깐만 스크립트를
going to
첫
create
번째
our very
변수.
first variable. So we're actually going to use this variable to be able to change this number here. So usually in code, it's pretty bad, especially when you have what's called a hard
뭔가 하드 코딩
because that
됐다고
means that if you ever
하는구나.
need to change it, say we reuse speed for some reason ever again, we'd have to keep changing the number 20 versus we could just change the number in our
뭔가
variable.
하드
So what we're going to do
코딩
is
됐다고.
we're going to use the word float. Now float is a keyword that helps the computer know that we're creating a number with decimals in it. And then we're actually going to say what the name of this variable is. So we can call it speed. And we're going to use the equal sign here. Now it's very important, the equal sign to your code is very different than an equal sign when you're doing math in the real world. So this actually will assign our speed variable a value. So our speed will be set to whatever number we put, and it will store that number whenever we need it. So because we are using decimals, we'll type a 5.0, so this is a decimal, and then we add a semicolon at the end, so that way we know we're at the end of this line. We are done with our statement. Now you can see that our IDE is pretty mad at us right now. This is red underline. And it says that it doesn't understand what this 5.0 means. So actually what we need to do is we need to tell
되게 친절하게 알려주네. F도 추가해줘라. 오케이.
So now, as our computer tries to understand this line of code, now our computer knows that 5.0 is supposed to be a float specifically, so we add that F. So now we have our speed variable. It's always carrying the number 5. If we ever need to, we can change it to be 10 or 20, whatever we want it to be. And so where we have our 20, in our update method, where we're transform.translating our object, we'll take out our 20 and just put speed. So now, our code knows that we are multiplying by the value 5, even though we're using the word speed. So that's very helpful. So now, if we test our game, our vehicle should be moving a little slower. Not bad, so it's moving about 5 meters a second, and now it's just pushing those boxes along. Now, we want to actually be able to see this speed variable in Unity. So right now, our speed variable is a variable that belongs to this entire class. It's what we call a member variable. And right now, it can only be seen inside of methods inside of this class. It can't be used outside of this class. Now, we can actually use the word private to denote the level of access that somebody has with our speed variable. The private keyword is what's called an access modifier. In fact, public keyword is also an access modifier. So private can only be accessed within this class. In fact, this start and update method are both inherently private, so you don't actually need to type the word private. Versus the word public means that you can access, you can see, you can use this class in other places. So in fact, we want to be able to see and interact with our speed variable. So we will actually make this a public variable. So now that we've used the public keyword to modify the access, you should be able to see it in Unity. Now, a cool thing that happens when we go into Unity, if we click on our vehicle in the hierarchy, in the inspector, underneath the player controller script, you can actually see our speed variable now because it's public. And we can actually change the values however we want just by typing in any number. So I'll set this to 15, and then we'll press play. And you should see the car zip down the road, and a cool thing I can do, if I left click and drag on the speed variable, on the word itself, if I drag it to the left, it actually brings it to negative. You can see it racing down the runway. And if I bring it up, it goes up. And so this is a cool way to see exactly how fast you really want this vehicle to go. And then 5 is kind of a good speed. Now let's make it to like 11 or so, 12, cool. Now we'll stop playing. Oh, our speed variable resets to 15. Well, if you remember, when we enter play mode, if we edit values, it'll reset those values when we exit to the way that it started when we were in our speed. So it actually set it back to 15, so we'll just bring this to like 10 for now. And then we'll see. A fun little tip for when you're programming, something that people commonly say whenever they create their variable, but then also assign it a value at the same time. This is called initializing a variable. And so we initialize the speed variable to be at 5.0 for its speed. So what you're going to do is you're going to create your very first variable so we can store the speed that we want our vehicle to move. Make sure that you use the keyword public, so that way we can see this variable outside of this class. Use the keyword float, that way we know that our speed variable is a number that uses decimals. We can choose what we want to name our variable, so we'll name it speed, and then we use the equal sign to assign or to set our speed to be 5, and then make sure if you use the .0, just to add an F at the end, so that way our program knows that this is a decimal number, and then in your update method, change the 20 to speed and test your game. And then while your game's playing, if you select the vehicle and then you go into play mode, you can actually left click on the speed under the player controller and drag it, and you can change the numbers by scrolling side to side. Now it's your turn.
오케이. 뭐야? 로그인이 안 돼 있었나? 다음 거는 새 카메라 스크립트 생성. 고정된 카메라 대신에 새
We've
카메라
added a
스크립트
variable
생성해야 된다.
to our vehicle. So
Okay.
you select the vehicle in the inspector, you can see that speed variable under the script. Now when we press play, we can actually click on that speed variable, drag it, and we can control the speed. So we've got some good control, but our camera is still locked. We can control the speed. Now when we press play, we can actually click on that speed variable, drag it, and we can
잠시만요. 이렇게 하면은
control the
조절이 잘
speed. So we've got some good control, but our camera is still locked in the same place. So we want to make it so we can actually follow the player as they move back and forth. To do that, we'll create a new script. So underneath your assets folder in the project window, if you go down to scripts, right click on scripts, create a new C# script. We're going to name the script follow player, because this will attach to our main camera, and the behavior will be that the camera will follow the player. Make sure you name it correctly with the capital S and the capital P, with no spaces, and then we're going to left click on follow player and drag it onto our main camera. Now if we click on our main camera in our hierarchy, you can see the follow player script has been applied as a component. So now we're going to open our follow player script by double clicking on it. So now our script has opened in our IDE, and what we're going to do is we're going to use public variables, but in a very different way this time. So what we can do is we can actually get a public variable, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to use a class or a type, in this case a game object. And so like I said before, things like our obstacle or our vehicle are game objects in our project, and so actually we can get references directly to our different game objects like our player. If we check in Unity, you can see now in our follow player script, it's added this line of code. If we select our main camera in the hierarchy, you can see that the follow player script has this player variable, and it's looking for a reference to a game object now. And so in fact, we can actually left click and drag our vehicle from our hierarchy into that box, and now our player variable is tied to our vehicle. This is one way that you can get a reference to an object in the scene for another object to use. In this case, our main camera to use the vehicle. So variables can be used in really powerful ways, not just to store numbers, but to store references to other things that already exist in our game. Now what we're going to do is we can do a really interesting thing where we can actually get the transform. So this gets us the current transform component of the game object that this script is applied to, in this case our camera. So we get our camera's transform, and we can actually just get its position overall. And so this will give us the X, the Y, and the Z of where our camera currently is. Now, we're going to use that equal sign, that assignment operator. We are going to set our camera's position. Now that we have a reference to our player, we can actually use player. The player also has a transform component, and we can actually get that position from the player's transform component. And then if we semicolon to end our statement here and make sure we save, so now our camera's position will be set to the player's current position. So now, if I press play and you watch in the scene view, watch our camera and our vehicle, our camera should be set to the position of our vehicle. There you go. Kind of works. It's underneath the car, which is close enough to what we want for now. So you can watch it as it drives down the road, runs into the different boxes. Cool little perspective. So what you're going to do is, in Unity, make sure you go to your project window, right-click on scripts. You're going to create a new script, a C# script. You're going to name it follow player, capital F, no space, capital
이렇게
P.
지정하면
And
된다.
then you can left-click and drag it onto
조금
your
더
main
바꾸고
camera,
싶긴 한데.
or just add it as a component using that little handy button in our inspector for the main camera. You're then going to open up the follow player script by double-clicking on it. In our follow player script, you're then going to create a new variable. This time it will also be public, but this time it'll be a game object variable. So that will be the type of variable that we're creating, and we're going to call it player. So that'll be the name. And then in our update method, add this line of code. So you get the camera's current transform position, and you're going to set that to the current position of our player's transform component. And then last but not least, a really easy step to forget is make sure you select your main camera in the hierarchy. In the inspector, you can see on the follow player script, there's a player variable that has no game
이게
object
아닌
attached.
거네.
You're going to make sure you
벡터3가
left click on the vehicle in your hierarchy and drag it into that box. So then your player variable is assigned to the vehicle in our scene. So then when you press play, you can watch it as it drives down all the way down the road. Now it's your turn.
카메라 위치에 오프셋 추가, 차량 위로 옮기기, 뉴 벡터 3를 하라고. 이렇게 하면 된다. 꽂아.
Our camera is now positioned, unfortunately it positions underneath the vehicle, which is an interesting perspective, but not exactly what we're looking for. We actually want to create the same effect that we had in our camera here, in our preview, so that way we're following behind the player instead of underneath the vehicle. So we'll change that perspective using some of our code. And then what we're going to do is where we're actually setting our camera's position to our player's position, this is actually where we're going to add to our player's position so that we can offset our camera above and behind our player. Fortunately, we already did some of this work before, so luckily the player vehicle is at 0, 0, 0. And then what we did with our camera is we actually put it at 5 on the Y and -7 on the Z, so it went up and then it went behind our player here. So we can actually use those values to be able to reposition our camera behind the player when the game starts. So using our update method, since we're constantly keeping track of the player's position, we want to add, in this case we just use a plus sign like you would on a calculator, and then we should add, I believe it was 0, and up 5 meters, and then back 7 meters, so -7. So that doesn't seem to work. So see. I believe the problem is, so in fact, our player's position is giving us a vector 3. And here, although this would make sense in our heads, this doesn't make sense to our computer at all. Our program is trying to add some statement that doesn't exist, and is trying to add it into our vector 3. So what we actually need to do is we need to add 2 vector 3s together. So we actually need to create a new vector 3, and we're going to use the keyword new, because we're actually creating a new vector 3 instance. We're not creating a vector 3 variable that we're storing or saving. Since this is just temporary, we use new vector 3. And so now this will actually create a new vector 3 just for this line of code. That'll have the values of 0 on the X, 5 in the Y, and -7 on the Z. Last but not least, we're going to add a comment to our code. So we're going to say offset the camera behind the player by adding to the player's position. Now we make sure we save. So now if we test our game, we should see that our camera is just following the vehicle. Awesome. Now
카메라 비하인드 플레이어 ID to the player's position.
Now we make sure we save. So now if we test our game, we should see that our camera is just following the vehicle.
이번 거는 그래도
Now we have a much better
간단하네요.
view of where we're driving and where we're going. So what you're going to do is in your camera's position, where you set it to be the player's position, you're just going to add a new vector 3 with the values of 0, 5, and -7. Now it's your turn.
변수를 카메라 위치를 잘 바꾸는 방법.
Now our camera
위에다가 바꿔준다. 이건 스태틱으로 해도 되고, 벡터 3 0 5 -7 이렇게 비율을 적어줘.
is positioned perfectly behind our vehicle as it drives down the scene. What we're going to do is we're just going to clean up our code just a little bit, make it easier to understand. In our follow player script, I mentioned that it's really bad to have hard-coded values. So we're actually going to take this vector 3 we've created and create a variable for it. So this one will make a private variable, so it can only be used inside of this class. So I'm just going to use the keyword private here, so you can see how it's used, very similar to a public variable. And for this, because we're making a vector 3, we need to make this variable a type of vector 3, and we'll call it the offset. Now we set this variable to be this value here. In fact, we can just cut by Control or Command X with the code highlighted, and then we go to where we had the offset, and we paste with Control or Command V. So now our offset vector variable is being set to that new vector that we made before with our offset position already added to it. So now, in our update method, we can just add where we removed that bit of code, the word offset, and because offset is a vector 3 being added onto a vector 3, then we can set our position properly. Make sure you save, go back into Unity, and press play, and you should see that nothing has changed, which is exactly what we wanted to happen. So, what you're going to do is in your follow player script, you're going to create some variables of your own. You're going to make a private vector3 variable called offset, and you're going to initialize it by assigning it that new vector3 offset that we had created down in our update method. And then you're going to remove that new vector3 line and just replace it with the word offset. So that way, it's always just using the offset variable, and if we ever need to change our offset numbers, we can just do that here at the top of our code. And then just make sure that you press play and test to see that it's working exactly like it should. Now it's your turn.
레이트 업데이트를 사용해서 카메라를 부드럽게 움직이기. 카메라가 흔들리기 시작했습니다.
Okay, now that we have our camera following our vehicle properly, you might notice that there's a weird effect happening with the vehicle itself where it's kind of stuttering back and forth. And so we can make one small change to our follow player script to make our vehicle move super smoothly. Now, essentially what's happening is, in our update method, our vehicle and our camera are both moving at the same time. So sometimes the vehicle might move first, and then the camera might move, while other times, the camera might move and then the vehicle will move, and so it creates this stuttering effect. A simple thing that we can do with our update method is change it to late update with a capital L, make sure there's no space, so it's all one word. And with this late update method, essentially what it will do is update after our update method happens. So if you remember, for our vehicle, it's moving through the update method, constantly moving forward, and then late update is called, which will then move our camera after the vehicle is moved. So if I save this script using Control S or Command S on a Mac, head back over to Unity and then test out our script to see if it works, we'll press play, and you can see now that the vehicle is moving much smoother because of that late update method, where the vehicle moves first, and then late update happens, making the camera move to follow the vehicle. So what you're going to do is head into your follow player script, and where update is, we're going to change that to late update with a capital L and a capital U, no space, so it's all one word. Once you've changed update to late update, make sure to save your script using Control or Command S. Head back into Unity and test out your project using the play button, and you should no longer see your vehicle stuttering in your camera frame.
훨씬 부드럽긴 하네.
Now it's your turn.
플레이 모드 틴트 컬러 편집. 변수를 생성하고 편집할 때 플레이 모드에서 변경하는 실수를 피해야 됩니다. 이건 뭘까? 처음 들어보는 것 같은데.
Our camera is now well set up in our game to be behind the player, and we even added in some variables to make our code more organized. Now we're actually going to fiddle around with our Unity interface again, just like we changed the layout, but this time with a very helpful tip to know when you're playing your game. So you can see when you play the game, your interface goes from a light gray to a dark gray, which is helpful, but not entirely visible. So I'm going to show you a cool little trick that I do, so it's really easy for me to know when I'm in play mode. At the very top left of Unity, there's an edit button. If you're on Mac, there will be a Unity button, and then you click Preferences. From my edit menu, I have a Preferences option as well. Now, in our preferences, we have all of these different options. Right now we're on General. There's one down here called Colors, and specifically, there's an option here called Play Mode Tint. So this is actually what controls the tint of our interface when we're in play mode. So, if I select this by clicking on it, you see it brings up a color picker. So you can pick colors yourself, you can move it around, you can change the opacity so that it's more clear, or if you want it to be really dark and really visible, entirely up to you. So I have a setting that I like to use, so I'm just going to type in values for myself, so 157, 194, 239, and then we'll make this like 150. So now I should have a fairly transparent light blue, so I can close out of my preferences. You can see that it actually saves it immediately when you set that color. Close out of the preferences. Now when I press play, you should see a bluish tint pop up over all of my window. So that's super helpful. So now I know when I'm editing values, if I'm in play mode, or if I'm in my scene. And so that way I don't accidentally change something that just gets reset and then I don't remember what the value is.
플레이
Very helpful
모드
tip.
틴트. 이걸 바꿔야겠다. 딴 걸 바꾼다. 플레이 모드 틴트. 딴 걸 바꿔. 157194 하나는 까먹어서 이렇게만 해서 해보자. 오케이. 어우, 너무 부담스러워서 그런데. 회색 별로 안 변하는데. 색깔 뭐 없을까? 노란색. 그렇게 별로 멋있지 않네. 흰색은 뭐 별로다. 이게 제일 낫다?
Just something to make your life a little bit easier as you're testing your game out and trying to figure out why, for example, if you click on something, it's not moving or whatever. So what you're going to do is in the top left of your editor, you're going to see an edit or a Unity button. Click on that. Go down to preferences, click on that. You'll see this preferences window pop up. You can click on the colors option. Under the colors, the very first one, under general, should be play mode tint. If you click on that, you can select different colors, you can change the opacity, and then when you exit, it saves your color. You can exit out of preferences, so then when you play your game, you can see when you've entered play mode, which is really handy. So, now it's your turn.
오케이.
So our game is in a pretty good place now. We have our camera that follows behind the player and it's offset. So that's some cool functionality that we've added. We've also gained a lot more programming knowledge. In our follow player script, we learned how to use our first public variable, in this case, so that we can actually attach a reference to our player in Unity. We learned that variables also don't have to just be numbers. They can be game objects, or they can be vector 3s, they can be of whatever type they want, as long as you make sure that you assign the same thing to the type of variable that you had. So we have a vector 3 offset, and we assigned it to a vector 3. We learned about the difference between access modifiers, like the public and the private keyword, so that we're able to interact with and use
맞아,
variables in different ways
퍼블릭으로는
inside
여기
and outside
창에서
of our script.
떴어.
We also learned how to initialize our variables. Now, in the next lesson, we'll add our last lines of code so that we can really control this
속도
player as they drive down the road
여기서
and help turn around all these different obstacles so we
클릭을
don't just keep
왔다
pushing
갔다 할
them all
수도
the way
있고
down. See you in the next
힌트
lesson.
바꿔서 이걸 설정할 수도 있었고. 오케이. 주행 준비. 다음 거 뭐 하는지 볼까? 장애물을 피할 수 있어야 된다. 입력을 할 수 있어야 된다. 속도 조절할 수 있어야 된다. 미끄러지지 않고 코드 계층 구조 수업 요약. 와, 좀 어렵겠다. 이번엔 다음에 또 해보자.